You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players. And all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
Hello everyone, welcome back to episode 204 of Arsenal Pass. This week on the podcast, we're talking a couple of topics related to the game itself, Flesh and Blood, but some sort of concepts within the game. We're calling it off the cuff, or Pankaj is calling it off the cuff. We're going to talk about things like skill ceilings and agency and what those mean in Flesh and Blood, and maybe we might rant a little bit. I don't know, who knows? We'll see how it goes, right, Pankaj?
Just some higher level musings and perspectives on the game. I did initially call it rants, but I think that has a bit too much of a negative tone, at least for like what I want to talk about. It's really just something that's just been, bouncing around in my mind recently a little bit, and we'll get into that. How has your week in Flesh and Blood been, Hayden?
Yeah, my week's been good. I've been doing a lot of prep for Pro Tour London, playing a lot of Classic Constructed this week. I need to shift my attention to draft. I don't know how much draft you've watched or played. I need to start to spend a bit more time on this draft format because I feel like I don't really understand it, but I'm starting to get a really good handle on a lot of decks within the CC format. This past week I've been playing a lot of Arachne Marionette, which I know will make you happy. I've been playing a lot of Jarl. I've been playing some Slippy, which I'm done with that, I'll be honest. I've been playing a decent chunk of Aurora, which I think is probably the best deck in the format right now, which Pankaj is saying, see, I was right all along. And I've been playing a bit of Kano and a dash of Rhinar, but poor Rhinar just really doesn't cut the mustard these days. So yeah, that's been my week in Flesh and Blood.
I like how you said a dash of Rhinar, sort of hinting or maybe psyoping people that there's also some dash in there, but no mechanologist in these?
No mechanologist. How about you?
RTN season's over, so I'm back in the lab, back doing my mad scientist stuff, and I've been experimenting once again with Mark New, so cool. The Hunter's Clave stuff in New. Basically, from my stint into Marionette, where I enjoyed the deck and thought it was powerful, part of me was thinking, can I do this exact same thing in New instead to solve a couple of problems? So you miss out on the Marionette hero ability, which I will admit is better than the New hero ability, but you get quite a few things in return. You get, firstly, Siren's Call, which I think by in of itself could already be convincing enough to at least give it a shot. But you also get the Mystic Reacts, which help you turn on Bonds of Agony a lot more. Because one problem I was facing with Marionette is oftentimes you can't actually resolve your Bonds of Agony without giving up too much equipment. So New has not only the Mystic Reacts, but also Undertow Stilettos to just more easily turn on Bonds of Agony. And then also Mask of Recurring Nightmares, which is just another way for you to hide what's going on your turn. With Marionette, it's very much, you kind of need to block the first. It's very difficult for them to go around a lot of the times or disrupt you through like your blocks if you overblock. Whereas with Mask of Recurring Nightmares and New, you actually have that option. So these sort of theories are making me inclined to like test out Mark New a little bit more, especially now that I know what's strong about the Mark package in Marionette, now that I've played Marionette a bunch. So that's been my week in Flesh Blood, and I think it's been going decently. I think there's something there. It just needs a little more cooking time, as the kids would say.
What do you, as the kids would say, what do you think is? There's also another thing someone pointed out to me last week, which I thought was a good shout. Is against something like an Aurora, you obviously make magnetic somersault much worse when you banish their cards from the chain as opposed to Marionette. But now that you've spent some time with Marionette, you've spent some time with New, with some of these elements of Marionette, if you were to choose either hero to build to be able to beat Aurora, or I guess do either of them in your view have the potential to make it a good matchup, which one would you choose?
I'm going to go with New, actually. The somersault thing that you brought up is very, very relevant. When I play Marionette into Aurora and they do that on my stealth attack, I get really annoyed that I'm on Marionette and not a New. The other thing I forgot to mention about New is that her other cards, specifically Leave No Witnesses and Surgical Extraction, Marionette doesn't even play Surgical Extraction, so New can play Surgical Extraction, it's a very strong card, and Leave No Witnesses. Both of these cards can be pumped because she has reacts that can actually pump those.
Yeah.
Unlike Marionette. Every time Marionette sends a Leave No Witnesses, it's always 4. And that was also something that frustrated me about the deck. Some Marionettes are on Yellow Shred, or some colors of Shred, which can help you in a sense, like buff those attacks or have reacts on those attacks. But a lot of them aren't. At least my build wasn't, so I was getting a bit annoyed by that, and I was thinking, if I put this in new, at least those attacks get more difficult to block as well, alongside all the other benefits I was already talking about.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's been...
Makes sense. Yep. Seems like we've come to a similar conclusion. I kind of spent a lot of time with Marionette this week and have thought, I wonder if I could just be playing new with Hunter's Glaive and be in a better position. And to be fair, you'd already told me, I guess, a few weeks ago, you'd prior to Road to Nationals or the first week of Road to Nationals, you'd played around with that. And I was like, I think that seems like a really good place to be. So, yeah, new's interesting. New's interesting for sure.
Yeah, that's why I started, the pre-RTN season. I started with new first before Marionette. And I think what ended up happening was I didn't understand what was strong about the Mark package or how to make it strong. So I ended up cutting more and more of the Mark package from the new list, and it just ended up being like a weird, like not too strong mix of the two. It was after my stint with Marionette where I was like, these are the strong things about it, and these are how to make it strong. That I was like, okay, now that I understand it better, let's try it new. Which, we'll see how that works out. Shall we move on to the news, Hayden?
Let's do it.
Cool. So Battle-Hardened Charlotte and Battle-Hardened Taipei happened this past weekend. Battle-Hardened Charlotte was massive. I believe it was, the biggest Battle-Hardened to date.
Wow.
With over 180 players. And Michael Feng ended up taking it down on Enigma. It's been his hero for quite some time. Congrats to Michael Feng on that. The top 8 was super interesting, Hayden. There were no Auroras and no News either. These two were the top performing decks across RTN season, but neither of them featured in the top 8 of Battle-Hardened Charlotte. Instead, there was a Dash.io. There was an Uzuri. There was a Prism, an Enigma, an Ira, a Vincent, and 2 Zens. Now, the Zens and the Enigma and the Prism somewhat can probably expect, but Dash.io, Uzuri, Ira, and Vincent all sort of, not exactly like dark horses. Like, I guess Dash.io and Uzuri are definitely dark horses. The Ira, Vincent are kind of like, they were around in RTN season, but a super fascinating top 8, I think.
They all have something in common, though, I think. You want to know what that is?
I feel like you're testing me.
I think they all have even to good Aurora matchups. Like, I think that's what all of these decks have in common in this list. I think Ira is probably the weakest of and we can talk about Enigma because I think
I was gonna say Enigma. I disagree that Enigma has a good Aurora matchup.
I think you can build to have a good Aurora matchup. That's been my experience in the past week or so. But I wouldn't say it's phenomenal. That's why I'd say even to a good matchup. But yeah, I think Enigma and Ira stand up at Vincent, Prism, Uzuri definitely, Zens, Dash.io. I think they have good Aurora matchups. So yeah.
Agree with that. Although the Prism one, from what I'm hearing, is changing with the Armory deck inclusions. Both these Battle-Hardens were played without the Aurora Armory deck, Correct. Of course. But I've heard the Prism matchup has gotten better with the Armory deck coming out.
Interesting. What makes that?
Other than that, yeah.
What makes that so?
I think Face Purgatory is a big one.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense, actually. Yep.
So, other than that, we also had Battle-Hardened Taipei. Congrats to, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Gao Zhipeng on taking it down on Aurora. There were 6 Auroras in the top 8 over here, very different from Battle-Hardened Charlotte. This is more akin to what I was expecting the top 8 to be. Although, again, this was before Armory deck. But yeah, 6 Auroras in this top 8. But important to note, both PQ Plus events across the weekend were taken down by Aurora. So, while she was missing from the Battle-Hardened Charlotte top 8, she was still letting us know of her presence in this metagame.
I think that the first week of a new meta, so to speak, or the first 2 weeks of new meta, people can have this tendency to try and overreact. And I honestly think that might have been a little bit of the case in Charlotte, in terms of people being like, I'm not going to play Aurora, I'm going to play the level 2 deck or whatever it is. I think people do have this tendency to do that in Flesh and Blood. I'll tell you, I would say, though, regionality-wise, the region that doesn't do that, honestly, is Asia. I think they just tend to just play the best aggressive deck. And so I'm not surprised to see a difference in the two top 8s there. But like you say, even in Charlotte, PQ Plus ended up being taken down by Aurora. I think Aurora best deck in the format right now, and I think that only strengthens with the Armory deck, although I'm really interested with calling Kobe this weekend to see exactly how that plays out, because there's a lot of thought that the natural progression in Aurora is play this instance, play more non-attack actions with Skyward Serenade and with the new blue, and you play Face Purgatory and if people are ready for that and they're like, cool, I'm packing Warmongers this weekend, I'm coming ready for you to be playing more non-attack actions, is that actually the right decision? And that's what I'm really interested to know, how this weekend plays out for Aurora, to be honest.
And Calling Kobe will be streamed. I know I'm going to be tuned in to that for sure. Saw the tweet of Mansant landing in Japan. Any predictions, Hayden?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be won by Aurora. I think what's going to end up happening is that Aurora is going to split the difference a little bit on the types of decks played. If Aurora does well, I kind of feel like, honestly, it won't be an Aurora that looks drastically different. I think it'll be one that's kind of plug and played a couple of bits from the Armory deck, mostly, honestly, Skyward Serenade and Skizik, and plays in a more traditional... I think what's so strong about Aurora is that it is... we keep talking about this. It's really hard to disrupt, but the more non-attacks you put into your deck, the argument is that you brick less, right? But I think it becomes a lot easier to disrupt if that's the case. And I'm actually not convinced that it actually bricks that much less, because I think if you've built out your Aurora deck in the right way and already cutting some of these more bricky cards, you're already reasonably consistent. So, yeah.
So I tend to agree, except that, like, I definitely agree with the theory that she gets more vulnerable to Warmongers when she adds more of these non-attacks. But in practice, what we seem to have noticed is that the density of non-attacks isn't high enough for you to warrant taking damage to resolve your Warmongers. Typically what ends up happening is you Warmongers them, and they're like, oh, I have this one non-attack I wanted to play. I guess I'm going to Arsenal this. And still resolve the rest of my hand anyway, because it's not like I have that many. It's not Viscerai levels or I have 30 non-attacks in my deck. You've caught me on 2 to 3 in my hand or whatever. It's on the order of, like, they have 1 in their hand, and then they're like, cool, this goes to Arsenal instead. Then that's been our experience, our early experience at least, where it's such a risk to take damage to go ahead and resolve your Warmongers, despite the non-attack density having increased, because it's not to that high level of a density. My prediction is that I think Aurora takes it down. I'm going to have a small asterisk. It could be Shoma on Uzuri. It is his region after all. So that's the other asterisk I'll give, because, I mean, we saw in Uzuri in the top 8 of Charlotte, and to your point, I think Uzuri is probably one of the better assassins into the aggro decks, so
yeah,
could
fair.
See that one happen.
I agree with that. Uzuri is one to watch for Pro Tour London, honestly. I think it might be. I think that Aurora could win it. I just said then, I think if it does, I think it'll be something that doesn't look too drastically different. I am also interested to see, both sides of that conversation on the Warmongers and how that plays out this weekend. I don't disagree. I do think it makes it more, before Warmongers was terrible against them. I think it is now a card that can potentially have some... so it's going to be decks that just naturally play Warmongers, though, not decks that have to force it in, I think, to your point. I think my kind of other watch-outs for this weekend, honestly, like, I've been playing quite a bit of Jarl, and I think given that this region is usually quite an aggressive playing region, that sort of level 1 aggro deck, I think there'll be a lot of Aurora, I think there'll be a lot of Zen, I think there'll be a lot of Syndra, and I like Jarl in that meta. I think the Zen matchup is by no means free or easy. I think it's quite a complicated matchup, but I really like the Syndra and the Aurora matchups on the right builds of Jarl. So I don't know. Jarl's one to watch out for me this weekend.
You like the Aurora matchup as Jarl?
Depends what build you're playing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because, I kind of felt like Jarl was just a little bit too dirtily, and then kind of gets blown up. And they could do stuff like, I don't know, IP or Blizzard until the Aurora plays their Flicker Wisp arc, I guess. But it's still a little bit... It feels a little bit suspect, but maybe I'm missing something.
I think...
I want to move on.
I think people aren't playing proactively enough with their Jarl decks. I think they are... dirtling is a good word. Dirtling around too much. There's cards that I particularly like. I think Frostfang is a really overlooked card, for instance, in Jarl right now. So, yeah, I honestly do think that Jarl can have a good matchup to Aurora, and it's not that crazy. You're not giving up a lot of other things to do it.
So I have a question for you then. If you're looking for a more proactive Jarl, why Jarl over Victor?
Because I'm not certain that you can... I think you need the ice to be able to beat things like Zen and stuff as well. Like, you do need to have some amount of disruption. I also think Victor... If you just lose like your first clash, you often just lose so many games. It's so insane. Like, I think Jarl is much more of a... It's funny, we're going to talk about agency in this podcast. A deck that gives you avenues to come back into the game and to play yourself back into the game. I don't think Victor is, honestly, which that has been my continual frustration every time I try and revisit Victor. Is I'm like, this is such a one-dimensional deck, and honestly, it is a damage-dealing proactive deck, and it has to hope that its clashes and that its block cards line up well.
It's really the first clash. That's a very, very good point. It's just because you start with just one gold in your shield, and you really want to get to your second as soon as possible. So when you play Visit a Gold Main Estate, you actually start getting might tokens.
Yep.
Yeah, the first clash does actually affect so much. And also, the gold token means you get to ensure future clashes, all just, playing towards the Gold Main Estate thing. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I think it's like a 10 or 15% rate like change. I think it can change your win rate by like 10 or 15% in a game. It's insane, losing or winning that first clash.
Yeah, it is very, very impactful. I want to move on to talk about London real quick, Hayden. There is an exciting announcement, which I think I will let you go ahead and announce this one, because you're about to be in London, but in what capacity?
I will be in London for Pro Tour London, but I will not be playing. I will be joining Pankaj Bhojwani as well as Sam O'Byrne and Brian Gottlieb in the booth calling Pro Tour London, which I am deeply privileged and super excited about. This is going to be my first time casting at the Pro Tour level, and couldn't be in better company. So yeah, I'm absolutely pumped. It got, I guess, announced in an article this week on the Flesh and Blood website. I'm not sure if they'll at some point tweet about it or something, but we can talk about it now, which is really cool. So
the caster influence has finally taken its toll, I guess, and Hayden's joining us in the booth. I am so excited. I can't wait to just watch back the coverage and see you in the booth. I'm looking forward to it.
I'll be looking for your feedback. No, I'm honestly very, very privileged. It's been something that I've been eyeing up for a while. It doesn't mean I fully intend to continue playing Flesh and Blood competitively, but I have.
That's what he says now.
Yeah,
we'll get him.
But I think I've got something to share, and I'm excited to have the opportunity to do that. And what that looks like in the future, I don't know at this stage. Like I say, I still absolutely love playing Flesh and Blood at the highest level and want to compete and want to win more things in Flesh and Blood. So it'll be a balance for me for sure.
Yep. So we got both co-hosts of Arsenal Pass calling Pro Tour London. It's going to be a really good time. Hope to see you all there.
Exactly. Commander Cookout time. Let's get into it. This week we have a question. Well, first of all, if you want to get your questions in for the Commander Cookout, please do so. You can email us at arsenalpassfab@gmail.com. Drop them in the YouTube comments below. Let us know it is a question for the Commander Cookout. If you're an Arsenal Pass patron, drop it in the Discord. Or you can do what Jonathan here has done and flick someone a handwritten note or a follow-up written note at an RTN. So thank you to Jonathan. I'll read the question, Pankaj, if that's all right. Are there or have there been cards in Flesh and Blood that you were hesitant to play because you felt intimidated? For example, this is the first TCG my wife has played. She was intimidated by cards that had X in the cost or explanation. For the longest time, she avoided putting Ravenous Rebel in her deck because she didn't want to admit that she didn't fully understand the mechanics of the card.
I just want to shout out Jonathan here real quick. So Jonathan at that RTN saw that I didn't have an Arsenal Pass resource token, so actually gave me one. And did this before Hayden Dale has given me one. So that's just for the record over there. To the question, I can't say that I've been intimidated by a card in Flesh and Blood, but I think that's just because I've played quite a few card games before, like before coming to Flesh and Blood. Like specifically, like right before Flesh and Blood, I was very into Artifact, which in terms of complexity is definitely quite up there. So those kind of things came a little bit more naturally to me. But I will say, I've definitely had cards that I had to play several times before I actually understood what it did. Specifically, the one that comes to mind for me is Plans for the Worst. That's the new Riptide card from a couple of expansion slots ago. I played it across 3 different games before I fully grasped like everything it did. Like the first time I played it, like the cards went in person. I was just testing against a local like on Talishar, and then I played it and I was like, oh, do I want the collapsing trap here or do I want the tar pit trap? And then my opponent had to tell me, dude, you saw my hand. You can look at my hand. It's like literally what the card says. And the arsenal as well. I was like, all right, I don't need to like play in the dark. And then the next game, I played it again, and I was deciding my blocks like the turn after I played it. And I was like, oh, I don't know if you're going to Arsenal the last card or like send it at me. And then they were like, dude, Plans for the Worst doesn't let me Arsenal. It'll get destroyed. And I was like, oh my God, it does that too. So it's just, yeah, not like intimidated by a card, but definitely have had the need to play this a few times before I fully grasped everything that it did.
Yeah, I think that's such a good shout, because I do think if you've come from a background of playing TCGs, which honestly I would say is 80% plus of Flesh and Blood, which is actually lower than a lot of other games. I think you might be surprised. I think a lot of other games, it's natural, inherent that you jump from a game to a game, I think. But Flesh and Blood has attracted a lot of people who've never played TCGs before, which is really cool. And I think when you haven't played TCGs before, like these cards truly, like intimidating is a good word. Like they truly are in terms of understanding the mechanic, the amount of words on a card, like in terms of, and modality. You know, there's some cards in this game that have insane amounts of modality or require you to do, well, not insane amounts, but, you know, a few modes of, to choose from, or require you to do a couple of steps to resolve the card. And I think those cards are, yeah, they can be intimidating to newer players of a TCG. I think to your point, right, if you've played some of like a game like Artifact or a game like Magic, for instance, where some cards, I personally in Magic would avoid playing some cards that I felt were too complicated or that I would like stuff up, so I wouldn't play them when I was sort of younger playing Magic. I think with Flesh and Blood I do find less of that, but I think like I can really parallel what Jonathan says. I know I had, you know, someone who had never played TCGs before for the first time get into playing Flesh and Blood, and they felt the same. They're like, I kind of feel like decision paralysis on some of these turns, because not only do I have to decide what like just cards I'm going to play, but I have to decide like how I'm going to play the card, and also this card pitches, it attacks, and it blocks. Like that's 3 options I have to choose from. So once you add in something else that might add a complexity level to it, I think it's very true. So I actually, interestingly, I helped that person to just build like a really straightforward deck that just like kind of did one of 2 things really well and focused on those 2 things and didn't have to find like a complicated kind of pivot turn or a complicated kind of setup, or had cards that were going to cause maybe, you know, too much anxiety about what's the right decision to do with this card in this situation. Because interestingly, that person was like, oh, I just like feel embarrassed if I do it wrong. And someone's like, oh, you did that so wrong, which, you know, sometimes card players like to point that out.
Was it Fi? Was the deck Fi? Did you recommend it, this person?
So it was actually like aggro dash. It's just like boost the cards and swing your weapon at the end.
That makes sense.
It. Yeah. This is before Fi was printed, but now it could be Fi for sure.
To your point about the game system being complex itself, that I definitely resonate with. I think I was intimidated by the Flesh and Blood game system the first time I encountered it, in terms of exactly what you said, decision paralysis. The fact that the cards do like so many different things. I remember my first event was Rosetta pre-release, and I was taking so long to do my turns. I was like playing this Briar's Seal deck, and I was like, wait, and you plan my turn like 3 different times. I'm like, oh wait, no, I don't have the pitch for that. I was like, oh wait, no, so am I supposed to block with this? But then I can't make my embodiment. It was, that was definitely intimidating.
Yeah, it's not easy. Like honestly, it's not. And I think it's funny. I have played some Flesh and Blood with my now wife, Devon, and she was like, she played for a bit actually. She played through Welcome to Race. She played into even Arcane Rising. And she was like, at some point she was like, oh, there's just too many cards coming out. Like I can't keep up with the game, right? It's like she like board games, that sort of thing, or like contained like LCGs sort of thing. But she played a bit of Lorcana actually, and she was like, this game is just, I just play my hand. It doesn't take me like 2 or 3 minutes to have a turn. It just takes me like 30 seconds because I just play the cards in my hand out. I was like, yeah, that is true about Flesh and Blood. Like you play your cards over 2 turns, over 1 full turn cycle, and you can, you know, at base level do 1 or 3 things with them. So yeah, it's funny.
Easy, simple game.
Yeah.
Hours for sure.
Well, thank you for the question, Jonathan. And thank you for giving us a nice in-person question and a really nice, lovely follow-up as well, message to our dear friend Pankaj here. So we really appreciate it. If you want to get your questions in for the Commander Cookout, please do so. With that said, it's time for our main topic. It's time to go off the cuff with some... No, it's not rants. There's some great discussion, I think, to be had here. You've got some great points that I know you're going to cover off and lead us into some discussion on Pankaj around the idea of skill ceilings, of particular heroes, of thoughts and musings, as well as just things that have been coming up in that regard in the Flesh and Blood community, competitive community, player-based community, and then, you know, we might riff on some other stuff at the end, including things around agency, potentially. We'll see.
It's going to be fairly open-ended here. Both of us just came to this with some thoughts that have been bouncing around our heads, and we're just going to talk about it because we've got microphones in front of us.
And you have to listen.
So, again, yeah, this is not a rant. And I also want to start off this discussion by saying I don't want to imply that this is a trend, like what I'm about to talk about, or this is a result of the new design of Fab. I think often we end up trying to call out trends before they are actually even trends, and it's just like one data point. Even if it's just 2 data points, people will be like, oh my god, it's a trend. Like back when we had 2 back-to-back untalented sets in a row, and people were like, oh, Flesh and Blood's done, like LSS is done with talent. So we're like, wait, that's not a trend. So yeah, I want to make sure that I've laid the foundation that way. This is not a trend I'm talking about. This is just what I've been feeling a little bit recently. And I have no idea whether this is going to continue or what it is. Just going to talk about it.
You can do what other people do, where they just use anecdotal things and call it a trend as well. Don't even have data points. It's just purely anecdotal.
Just hard fact. Actually, scratch everything I said, and this is actually pure serious fact, and everyone needs to treat it as such. So what I want to talk about was skill ceilings, and the idea of, I guess, the height at which you can express your skill on a certain deck. And the paradigm that I'm going to use to illustrate what I want to talk about is specifically how you come back from a game when you are behind. And to talk about like how I felt like in the past, the 2 examples I'm going to use are Dromai and Icelander. Dromai I didn't play very much, but it was something I appreciated a lot when I watched it being played. I really appreciated the height of the skill expression that the deck offered its pilot. And Icelander I played a lot, and I felt that way. So in terms of how to come back from a game when you're behind, with Icelander, there were so many moments where I felt like I had to make a very serious call about giving up tempo now to carve my path to victory, so to speak. So for example, I'll be like, oh, I'm behind, but my only way back in the game is to seed even more tempo for this Insidious Chill, and then chain Ice Veins, and that's how I'm like back in the game. For Dromai, something that I saw a lot of the high-level players do is when they're behind, the Ash management resource suddenly becomes such a critical part of the game plan, where they're like, oh, I can't resolve this Asvala here because I need to make sure I have at least 2 Ash on the board, so when I play my Rake the Embers, I have enough Ash, and I don't have space right now because I'm behind to make more Ash. So there was this idea of carving out your game plan to put yourself in a winning position when you are behind. I think both those decks had that, a lot of it. And to be honest, these examples I gave, like the Insidious Chill example and the Ash example, don't even do the decks that much justice in terms of how much depth there was and how you had to carve your way to victory when you fall behind. Is like there was like so much more depth to it. You know, Icelander also had in certain matchups like the hexes and the potions, and Dromai had other like, you know, more impactful dragons, for example, like the Tomultai or whatever that had like play towards, for example. So and like Arthur Trehay's like PTLA top 8 games, in my opinion, are an excellent example of how Dromai's at the highest level just managed the Ash and had to manage the Ash in a very specific way to get to a winning position end state. I believe he ended almost all his games in those top 8s with like 0 Ash and like sending the lethal blow at the opponent, which is just like perfect resource management. So what am I trying to get at like for now? So this last year I've been playing a lot of Assassin, which still, as far as, you know, skill expression and like skill ceiling of the deck is still, I'd say, like it's you know, it's high. But something that I have felt these days is when I fall behind, say I'm playing New, I'm playing Marinette, instead of what it used to be with like Icelander, where I'm thinking, okay, how am I setting up this turn and the next turn to put myself in a position where in the following like 3 turns I'm in a winning position. These times I've been thinking, oh, I need to see a Codex in my next hand, and that's how I come back in the game. It's been a lot more tuned towards seeing a power card, like seeing like my 2-for-1 power card, rather than something I'm actively setting up now to put myself, like, the term that comes to mind is like carving out a path to victory. It's been less setting the road to the path to victory, and more, I want to see my power card in the next hand, and that's how I come back. Which is just the thing that's been bouncing around in my head recently a little bit. I have felt that lack of planning, so to speak, the lack of the ability to plan and set myself up to come back from behind, compared to like when I used to play Icelander. I ranted for quite a bit, Hayden. So do you have any thoughts on that before we like elaborate on this further?
Many thoughts. I think, first of all, I really resonate with that kind of earlier piece around. I'm going to stay away personally from terms like, I think, skill ceilings and it's funny because I did read your notes, but I had a note of myself that we might talk about agency, but actually I think it kind of comes into play a little bit here as well. So I think what's something really interesting about Flesh and Blood is that in a lot of games, it comes down to decision points and how impactful your decision points feel. And I think this is what you're describing, right? You're specifically looking through the lens of how you get back into a game from behind. But I think you can extrapolate this to so many different decision points in Flesh and Blood. And I think there's a few things that have shifted. There's also some external stuff that isn't related to the game play and game design, which is just our understanding of Flesh and Blood. And people are getting better at this game, I think. And people will make more, especially at a macro level, make better macro decisions in terms of the decks they play, the lists they play, and the game plans they come up with, so that you, I think, have maybe narrowed down some of the some of that, I guess, noise that would happen where you might be able to leverage an advantage from an opponent having misbuilt their deck or something like that, or they've not had the right setup to deal with your game plan. Even if your game plan doesn't go right, you might be able to get back into it, for example. But yeah, I do resonate really. I mean, I played a lot of Dromai, right? I played a reasonable amount of Icelander. I do resonate with those. I think there's three things that really kind of spring to mind for me as this kind of contrast you spoke about. I think one is around synergy of the game. I do think that for whatever reason right now in a point in time, there's a little bit less inbuilt synergy with some of these heroes. So for instance, I'll give you an example. There's 5 assassins right now in Classic Constructed, but I don't feel that there's necessarily... That's right, yeah? Azuri, Nu, Arachne,
yes.
And...
Wait, 3 Arachnes.
3 Arachnes, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know which one I forgot. I'll tell you what. You know exactly which one it is that I forgot. That, there doesn't necessarily feel like there's a lot of cards that they share, and their most powerful cards are their most powerful cards. They're not necessarily unique to that hero and the synergy they're trying to come up with. Whereas you take something like a Dromai or an Icelander, some of these cards that you'd be like, that is draft chaff, were like very impactful cards. I will use Brain Freeze as an example in Icelander. Like, there's cards that can have massive impact, and they synergize really well with what the hero does. And I think that's something that we don't have as much of right now. What part of that you kind of alluded to earlier is the fact that we've not had that same density of talent sets, I think. But another part of it is also the fact that there's been a conscious sort of change to simplify the game in a little bit in terms of having a little bit more variance come into the game, and that has impacted some of the design, I think. And you know what? I think for the most part, it's for really good reasons. I think in terms of increasing that level of a ceiling, but also decreasing the floor on something, so you get some of that variance. And I think that comes in the form of power cards. Honestly, it does. A card like Codex, right? A card, and to your point about like I'm now searching for a specific card sometimes. And I also think some of it is, I don't want to say it's not real, but some of it is driven by the fact of you're focused on a card rather than a particular strategy that you need to draw. You still needed to draw combinations of cards before, and you still need to draw combinations of cards now. It's just I think there's a heightened awareness of some of the specific power cards as opposed to more of the types of play lines you would go for, because it also comes through on the other side of, if my opponent draws that card right now, I'm probably dead, for instance. So I think that's the second one. And honestly, I think the third big thing that kind of stands out to me on what you just spoke about is just it's the style of decks that we're playing at the moment. I think there's just been a real movement of aggressive decks being prevalent in the meta to the point where you are, because we went through this ice period for so long, right? And even a deck like Lexi had a lot of like really intricate setups and different turns, and it was talented and things like that. But we're going through this period of time where you're using your life as the main resource all the time to trade back and deal damage. I take this damage so I can deal more damage, sort of thing. And that has kind of been the state of the game we've been in, as opposed to, the specific power cards being your resources. Like, I've now run out of that card, so my density of like threat is lowered, or just total density, threat density in your deck. Or even to your point about Dromai, there was another resource that they'd think about in the form of Ash, and we just haven't had as much of that. So those are I know I went on a bit there as well to reply to your question, but those are or your statement, but those are the 3 things that have stood out to me in terms of maybe some of the differences of, say, playing a game of Flesh and Blood right now and the feeling you might get as opposed to, say, a year to 18 months ago.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that part of it specifically, and which is, I want to emphasize again, this isn't I think this is a trend, or this is the way the game is going. It's just,
moment in time.
We are in that, to your point, we're in that current point of time where I'm feeling this way, and it sounds like you resonate with that as well, where we're feeling this way, but it might not be a trend. Maybe there's a hero in high seas that lets us feel the way we did about Iceland and Dromai.
Also, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, by the way.
Yeah.
I just think it's really interesting because it
that.
also informs how you might think about deck building, how you think about the way you play the game, is actually what's really interesting to me.
And to that point, I actually want to perhaps go a step further and say it could very well be the case that Iceland and Dromai were the anomalies, actually.
Yeah.
Because I can't think of too many other decks that were on that same level of you really had to craft a game plan over a series of turns. Like, you had to make micro decisions over a few series of turns to put yourself in a winning position. The other one that perhaps come to mind is Chain, where if you're against a fatigue deck as Chain, you did have to do things like this, like really set it up. Especially if you fall behind, like you did have to make some really, really interesting decisions with like pitching your Blood Dead cards back.
Yeah.
Or if you start to feel like some deck you weren't expecting to fatigue you is suddenly starting to fatigue you, you had to make, sort of more setup-y micro decisions over a few series of turns. But I can't think of too many that were in that same space. So it could very well be that those were the anomalies rather than us being like, it's different now or something. No, it's like those were the ones that were like maybe outliers.
Interestingly, to me, I think I can think of a couple of others, maybe not quite to the same level, but in a similar vein at least. But they're all talented, actually, which is quite interesting now that I think about it. The others that stand out to me are actually Ultim. I think Ultim had some of this with how you, particularly like the Ultim mirror, but I think like you would, if you fell behind in that matchup, that was one of the most interesting matchups in terms of how you got back into it, how you utilize your Crown of Seeds, how to utilize your your impact cards in that game versus how your opponents would line up their defense reactions, for instance. I think Prism has had that to some degree as well, particularly actually New Prism. And interestingly, I think New Prism, because of like your hat, because of the fact of trying to set up the right angel at the right time and then potentially into like an ALS, I think the problem with that one is that it's a little bit more one-dimensional. Often you're going for this very specific play of like, I get my Angel of Erudition and then I ALS and they can't kill it, and then I continue to draw cards to feed my like loop or find my loop or whatever it is. But I do think those heroes have at times in the meta had to really craft game states. Particularly, I think because Ultim had some like matchups that weren't like, I can think about Ultim versus Icelander, for instance. I think that matchup could be super, super interesting depending on what approach the Ultim took to the matchup. Like if they came with cards like the horn that blows up stuff, Imperial Warhorn, yeah. So those are the heroes that come to mind in a similar fashion, but I would agree they're not to the level of something like a Dromai.
So I could see the Oldhim one. The Prism one I'm less convinced by because that's more like a game plan. Like I'm not saying game plans don't exist anymore. Like the game plan going in is already, yes, I want to Erudition and ALS them. It's not I have fallen behind, what am I doing to, like, you know what I'm saying? So you already started with that as a game plan and you're executing it, like whether you're behind or not.
Yeah.
Whereas the Dromai and Icelander really had a bit more of a Dromai is like, wait, I literally cannot use this Ash right now on this pointless dragon because it has to be on an Ashwing later on, and I don't have the space to make more Ash, like stuff like that,
Well, Prism has a little bit with like
as
Soul, and also the fact that know that you have these auras that don't block in your deck. So, do you play them out, or what are you giving up in terms to play them out, and what does that set you up to into the future, given the game state right now? So, I actually think Prism had quite a lot of that, but it just takes a slightly different form, I think. Like in terms of your aura management and your non-block management in the deck, I think depending on how the game was going, that changed very drastically, I think, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, fair enough. So I think that's all I had to say about that topic. That was my little off-the-cuff opinion, off the cuff. We need a better term for this because I really don't want to say rant. Off the cuff, just
off the blade cuff,
off the cuff, cuff thought. I don't know.
Yeah.
Off the cuff monologue or something, soliloquy, if you will.
I have some questions for you though.
Do you have? Yeah. What's up?
What do you think good looks like when it comes to skill. I'm gonna use the word now. Skill ceilings in Flesh and Blood. Like, what do you ideally want? And does it look like a deck that has to make a lot of decisions in some of the more basic concepts of Flesh and Blood? So turn cycle defending and attacking, which I think Guardians have been a real big proponent of, right? Like, how do you, like, just go and watch Michael Hamilton play a match with Guardian and you're like, oh wow, I understand how value works and how you like nickel and dime to get to an end game, and you block efficiently, you attack efficiently, and you find the best ways to navigate turn cycles. So that's what I'm talking about. Or are you looking for something that plays on multiple axes, has to manage more resources than just life, deck, and threat density?
So, well, first thing, I do want to appreciate that you called me out on calling the my earlier off the cuff thought. I like that you called out that that's maybe not necessarily skill ceiling, because I do agree with you. I just didn't know what term to put on it
No,
as like
fine.
a nice little like a nice little ribbon wrap. This is like the overall concept I'm trying to express over here.
I get it.
That was the only term that come to mind. Yeah, it kind of applies and kind of maybe not. But your question of what does like quote unquote good skill ceiling comes to mind, like in a general sense, to answer this generally, what comes to my mind is the sort of deck where you need to have separate game plans for different matchups. So you had to craft your deck to allow it to perform different game plans depending on the matchup that you're sitting across. But also where the game plans weren't that linear, where your entire game is just executing that game plan, but rather there are moments of pivoting the game plan during the game itself. Like to basically, you're like, I come into this matchup, I'm like, I want to execute this game plan, but there are varying degrees of how far you lean into it, for example. And to give a more concrete example, like Verdance is something that kind of comes to mind these days, where you go into a game plan and you're like, oh, I've got this healing pod game plan, that's what I'm trying to execute in this game. But similar to like the whole Icelander thing, where it's like, oh, my opponent's taking a lot of damage from my mid-rangey turns where I'm felling them. Maybe I don't need all 3 H-pods or all 3 rampant growths, and I change my game plan to a smaller degree of that combo, for example. Or the flip side is my opponent is being super defensive, I need to try and set up a triple rampant or something like that. So, so coming back to the more general way of answering a question, where you have multiple game plans in the deck, and when you're playing the game itself on the micro level as well, you are constantly assessing, like, to what degree are you executing the game plan that you came into the matchup thinking you were going to do.
Okay, I like that. I think the thing is, you can disagree with me if you like, and I'll be interested to see if you do. I think that exists right now. It's just that those decks suck.
Go on.
So I think Verdance is a good example.
Like Verdance? Yes.
They're just not very good.
Fair point.
I think Riptide has some of this as well, quite interestingly as well. I think Riptide has some characteristics of this. Maybe?
Okay. I guess, I mean, Riptide has so many disparate builds that it's... I guess
maybe that's actually the problem. Maybe that's actually the problem, is just there's so many different builds of... Okay, we've got Verdance. Can I think of another off the top of my head before I...
I think Nu is actually quite close to it. Like I think it was actually many podcasts ago where I was talking about how Nu is coming close to me in terms of giving me the Icelander vibes. Nu is kind of close to it. Where I mean, it's just there just aren't enough matchups where hero ability matters, so it doesn't feel that much. But if you imagine if there was like more Victors or more decks like Victors, like the game plan into Victor is very different than the game plan into other decks. And to come back to my earlier point about like when I fall behind in the Victor matchup as Nu, I do get the sense of like what I used to feel like when I was like playing Icelander and stuff. I'm like, okay, wait, now I have to be super, super cognizant of what I'm losing life for, because I need to set up the banish and then have the life total to make use of the banish. And then suddenly I'm crafting a game plan that's spanning several turns again, which is like what I was talking about. It's just there just aren't enough of those matchups, so it doesn't quite feel that way.
Yeah.
But I would say Nu is kind of close.
That's interesting. Okay, yeah, I just had a quick look to see if there's any other heroes I think might fall in this bucket. And actually, it's maybe less than I thought. I think Fang might be one though, and I think Reinhardt kind of.
Aurora, kind of. Oh, yeah. Reinhardt, I could see Reinhardt.
Yeah,
Aurora, kind of.
But what it does best is just deal a ton of damage.
Yeah, it's also strange because she doesn't quite have that same level of flexibility. Like the combo isn't made up of like several parts and you can change the degree to which you're doing the combo. It's flicker arc. Like you're just doing flicker arc. Like, there's no like, I'm only going to do like one Frostex and one E-Pod.
Yeah, the nuance is small.
Yeah, exactly. So like the degree of like changing whether you're comboing or not is just, I guess you could be like, I don't need the flicker part of it. I just play the arc and I pop my equipment and my gold, and that's fine because my opponent took so much damage. It's like kind of that. But yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good discussion. So I was just curious, because I do think that, you spoke about trends versus potentially a moment in time, and I just think this is the ebb and flow of Flesh and Blood. Like what are the beauties of having a class-based system and a hero-based system is that you can guarantee that at some point you can kind of sunset certain elements of the game, and they will use the ban list to help aid that if necessary, or unbans, right? I look at a card that's currently, blue, Count Your Blessings is banned right now. At some point gets unbanned, or other cards they just unbanned Crown of Seeds and Blitz, for instance. So I do think they've got a lot of avenues to how they change the way the game at a more, at this level kind of plays. The game's always going to be the game. At a macro level, Flesh and Blood is still going to be a game of turn cycles and of evaluation and of resources, but they've got ways to change just some of the feel of the game, and I think that's really cool. And I think people, like you say, you gravitate towards decks like this, and I think so do many people, but other people also gravitate to decks that are just like consistently powerful, inherently powerful, or inherently can do something a little bit busted with a combo or whatever it might be, or are just pure value decks, for instance. Like people have different things they gravitate towards. There were people that absolutely loved KO and the heavy hitters better because they were like, this just feels like the kind of deck I want to play. It's powerful, it's consistent, and it deals damage, and it does kind of fun things where you draw cards. And then you've got people who are just like, no, I just want to just throw my daggers at people and just play all red line Syndra, and so there's always something different for everyone, which is just kind of the really cool thing about it.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to say, just in case it wasn't clear, this is obviously very, very much like my biased opinion.
Yeah.
Like you asked me what I think is like a high skill ceiling kind of deck, and I just described to you literally my favorite deck that I've ever played in the game, right? So it's just, to your point, it's the thing that speaks to me and the thing that I view. But yeah, people have different opinions. Obviously, like some people freaking love Hatchet's Story, right? Which is
crazy. Yeah. It's ridiculous. I don't understand why you'd ever like that, but sure.
Yeah, and I mean, there's skill expression in that, and some people might say that's the most skill expressive deck ever. I mean, you could see the Guardian mentality in that sort of opinion, right? Where it's like, you're doing numbers over and over again.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So this transitions well to one thing that I just wanted to tack on to the end of this, because I felt like it meshed quite well, which is, and I just bring it up because I would love to hear people's thoughts in the comments. I think it's quite funny. But this idea of agency. And people have different ideas of what agency is in Flesh and Blood. Some people will tell you it's just a concept. It isn't actually real. Agency is not real. It's all relative to the card in front of you, and there's a right and a wrong. And you get lots of different views on what that means. But I think when you talk about the skill expression, skill ceiling, or even just the game-to-game decisions and how they change either at a macro level or a micro level in Flesh and Blood, I think naturally agency comes up, and this idea of, well, I just played Bonds Zen and it doesn't really have agency, but if I draw the bonds I win, sort of thing, whatever. It doesn't matter which deck you're playing, whether you're playing, this is now my opinion, whether you're playing your Bonds Zen in Zen meta, or you're playing Dromai in the Dromai meta, and you, to Pankaj's point, or the Icelander, and you have all these decision points. It's the same either. Like the idea of agency doesn't change. You have decisions. There is going to be a decision you make, and there's going to be a right or a wrong decision at that point to make, a more favorable one or a less favorable one, and that kind of doesn't really change. And I think what's interesting when it comes to skill ceiling, yes, decks can be more complicated to make the right or the favorable or unfavorable decision, as opposed to one where maybe it's a lot more straightforward. But at the end of the day, you're still making a decision. And Flesh and Blood is all about making decisions. It's all about deciding whether you're going to get the most value out of this card by blocking, whether you get the most value out of this card from attacking, how you're going to set up your biggest damage turns. And yeah, that is the game of Flesh and Blood.
I think if you're defining agency as you making the decisions, then yes, it's hard to argue that there isn't agency. But I think when people say that, what they're implying is that their agency didn't matter.
Yeah, the variance
in that game.
decided it.
And what? Yeah, which is like what comes to my mind for like if I think of like a low agency matchup was back in the day the Phi Mirror, right? The Art of War Phi Mirror. It felt like it very much came down to who drew their Art of War first, like who resolved their first Art of War, the first like big Spreading Flame turn, and then like pop their mask and just put the opponent in a blocking position. Where the other side, they didn't see the Art of War and they couldn't pull off that turn. Their agency of where like they folded their entire hand to block, or if they tried to keep it and like send at the opponent in a hopeless attempt to raise, it doesn't matter. It's like, yeah, sure, they were the ones making the decision. To your point, like they had the agency to make the decision, but it didn't matter. Which is, I think, what people mean when they say they felt like they had no agency. Which is not that someone else was making the decisions for them. It was just that the decisions didn't matter. Which is like whether they chose, or like whatever they chose to do, the outcome of the game would have been the same.
Yeah, and this is the thing, I guess, is like. So I guess that's kind of my point to a degree, is that every matchup is going to have decisions, but if you're just doing the most powerful thing, you're giving yourself the best chance to win a lot of the time, or you're doing the thing that targets the meta in the right way. You're giving yourself the best chance of win. It doesn't really matter whether like you lose a game to variance. So if your deck is really powerful, but the only games you lose is to variance, or your deck is not as powerful, but the games you lose are to your deck just being less powerful than the other deck. So you get to make all the right decisions, and your decisions matter, but they don't matter quite enough because the opponent's playing a more powerful strategy. Like what's the difference at the end of the day? Like you still get to make decisions. You're just talking about how much variance plays into it, but why would you not just do the more powerful thing?
Because I think inherent in that was an implication that you are like the determining what is the most powerful thing to do is where the agency comes in, right? So if I want to say take Enigma as an example, it's the first thing that comes to my mind. Now I might have my mirror guy in my arsenal, and I drew my hand, and it's Spears of Surreality and Enigma Chimera.
Yep.
And I'm like, oh, this is gonna be super strong. I traverse block, play my mirror guy, and then go Spears Enigma Chimera. I'm like, oh man, I dealt so much damage. But someone else might say, no, you're not supposed to pop traverse there, because your opponent's playing a sort of deck that'll be able to just clear a mirror guy, and you just send vanilla damage in the Spears and the Enigma Chimera. What you have to do is actually wait to pair the mirror guy with the Phantasmaclasm, or with the Warmongers, or with a CNC, like a CNC pommel on a race face or something. And that's the most powerful thing you could do, which is where the agency comes in, is determining those kind of decisions. Because like when you're talking about, oh, you should just do the most powerful thing, and then you just do that, but different people have different ideas and opinions and experiences that lead them to believe different things about which one is the most powerful thing. And yeah, that's where the agency comes in, right? Sure. It's not a clear cut, this is more powerful.
Sure, but I guess my argument is that it kind of, at the end of the day, like a right decision and a wrong decision are the same no matter what your level of perceived agency is. Because let's say you determine that is the right thing, and then you just never draw the Phantasmaclasm. Oh, I'm so unlucky, I never drew the Phantasmaclasm. Like the correct play, depending on what you draw, what variance aspect you have, or what your opponent, or it just turns out that like, oh, your opponent just never drew poppers, so it didn't matter anyway. Like you could have just done the thing. Or actually you finally hit the Phantasmaclasm, you bottom the popper, and then they draw the popper off the top. Or you bottom, their like starter against this red line deck, and then they draw another one off the thing. Like I guess my challenge with like these kind of the idea of people, and what I think it is that I think is challenging is that people will tie agency and the decisions you get to make to a deck that has like a higher skill expression. Like, I have more decisions in this game to make, so therefore it's like I have more agency. I have more ability to impact the game and to play myself back into the game. But at the end of the day, there's still variance aspects across both of them, whether you're playing the aggressive deck that just says like the right decision, like the decisions might seem simpler, sure, but like they still have agency. They still have, they have the same amount of agency is what I'd argue. And what that is going to come down to is still aspects of variance. Like, we're playing a game that has variance inherent in it. So
I'm not sure if those two statements are contradictory, right? Yes, we're playing a game with variance in it, but that's not that statement can be true while the other statement of certain decks allow the pilot more agency could also be true. Like, both statements can be true at the same time. And actually, to that, like, what I want to ask you is, because I know you, like, similar to me, don't like playing aggro mirrors, and that's a reason why you avoid aggro decks. What's your reason for that then, if it's not something that comes back to the idea of agency.
I don't think it's enjoyable.
That's what I always thought it was.
No, I don't think it's enjoyable.
Why?
Because I don't feel that my decisions that I get to make are fun. Like, I don't think my decisions feel very transactional. And to your point of, like, I get to make less of them. And I think that if it's the most powerful thing I can do, then sure, I guess maybe I have to... Like, there's times where I've just played the aggro deck because I'm like, I can't find something that has more... I'm just going to say perceived agency, things where I'm going to get more decisions to make in a game, which is going to make the game more enjoyable for me. So if it's just not as powerful, like if my decisions, to your point, if my decisions aren't going to matter, whatever decisions I make, because my deck is just not powerful enough to compete, like I could build the world's most complicated Tickler Wasson deck and have all these really intricate decisions to make, but if the deck's not powerful, it doesn't matter. Like, I'm just going to lose all my games because Tickler Wasson sucks. So I think that's kind of the thing for me when it comes to like aggro mirrors. Like, I just don't think that the gameplay is particularly enjoyable. It's not so much about the agency, or I mean, it is a little bit about the variance, I will say. Yeah, for sure. I think the variance is the thing that kind of gets me about those games. I don't find that enjoyable, but I still get to make decisions like I would in any other game. It's just that those decisions themselves I don't find particularly enjoyable. Most of the time. I actually like playing aggressive decks sometimes. There is particularly aggressive decks that I do like playing when they have, I think, interesting angles on the meta. I really enjoyed playing the Dash deck that we played for Nationals last season, because I thought that you got to make a lot of micro decisions in the game that were quite interesting around like the resource of your deck that was left, or how to manage your resources and things like that. But yeah, I thought that was quite, and I knew I wasn't really going to play mirrors, so I thought that was quite interesting.
And that also had a sort of game plan deck building element to it as well,
For sure.
Which is really, really cool. Like the T-Bone specifically, in a meta where Zen really is relying on Traverse to like have the big pop-off. And Traverse and Strides of Reprisal, which is also like a play break. So it also had that aspect of it, which was really, really cool. Okay.
I mean, it's an interesting topic. Like, cool. Yeah. It's also one that's... I don't say it's complex. I mean, it is kind of in some ways, but it's also nuanced. Like, it comes down to how people use their terms of agency and variance to describe things. I think variance is a lot easier to determine because, you know, I think variance just translates to the likelihood, you know, the probability of things happening or not happening, right? And I think you can map variance through this game. There's been lower points of variance in this game. There's been higher points of variance, but I think agency is a much more broadly used term. It's a lot harder to narrow down what agency looks like in this game if indeed it does exist, right? And then so I just think it's a more complicated sort of piece, and I don't know, especially when you tie it into skills.
It's like a lot of times I think people might equate agency as like the antithesis of variance. Yeah. Maybe like agency is the opposite of variance. The higher the variance, the lower the agency, and vice versa. But yeah, I agree with you that agency just has a lot more nuance to it than just this is the reverse of variance. This is there's a lot more to it as well.
I like that you said that though, like saying that it's kind of I like that. I think that's a good way to phrase it, because I think that is the viewpoint that a lot of people might have. And I'm just saying, like, I'm not sure I agree. And I think especially when you trying to fold the idea of agency into skill ceiling and into variance, it all kind of that's when I think if you try and isolate it, sometimes it just doesn't matter. But where I do think it matters is what's enjoyable to you. Like, what do you resonate with? What is going to help you play the game? Because no matter which deck you pick up and play at this point in Flesh and Blood, it's going to have variance. Yes, there's more consistent decks than none. Yes, there's decks where your decisions are going to matter more, but it's because of the power level. It's because of what's happening under the hood, in my view. But yeah.
All right. Any other perspectives or musings or high-level thoughts on the game, Hayden?
I think Flesh and Blood is a very interesting game to dive into when it comes to these sorts of philosophical thoughts about the game and what it looks like. And I don't think that's going to change. I think the modality of cards makes this game so interesting, and to a point that you can never really pin down. we were talking about this ages ago about like a perfect game of Flesh and Blood, and we were like arguing about, can you have a perfect game of Flesh and Blood, right? And I think that's what is so interesting about this game, is that you can even have that argument, right? That you can even argue, is there a perfect game of Flesh and Blood? Because I think if the game was simpler, that would be no contest. You wouldn't even need to have an argument about it. Of course you could. So yeah, it's interesting. I loved the sort of discussion on this idea of skill ceilings, though, right? And what is maybe happening in Flesh and Blood right now versus what had happened previously, and how that is a result of the cards in the game, the heroes that are currently printed or legal, and the sets that we've had recently. And I'm really interested to see how that trajectory changes and maps itself as we go through things like High Seas, as we go into sets beyond that. And maybe, because like I say, I do think, we spoke about some heroes that might be in and around there that could have a similar feel to older heroes, but maybe they're not quite at the same level, right? But what if something changes? What if Verdance, or what if Nu, or what if New Prism gets these cards that help it do that? Then it changes again.
Yeah, or we could get heroes that are even further along that line of you have to actually craft your game plan over several turns.
Yeah.
I also
Agents of Chaos.
I have a hot take. Sorry, second.
We'll get more Agents of Chaos.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a hot take, another musing / perspective on the game. Some that, I don't know, many people might not agree with. You ready for it?
Go on.
Flesh and Blood is fun.
Flesh and Blood is fun.
I enjoy the game. Yeah.
It's a great game.
That's it. That was it.
Flesh and Blood's also hard. I'll add that one as well. How about that?
Yeah. That one I've heard quite a bit. That's less of a hot take, though. I think a lot of people say that more than they say Flesh and Blood is fun.
Yeah. I will end on one thing. I know I kind of brought it to the table and kind of argued for one point of view. I'm actually not against the idea of agency being a part of Flesh and Blood, just by the way.
I think you were more talking about
I'm just talking about the term and the use of it. Yeah.
And the degree to which it was used. I think it sounded like you were saying the word is abused a little bit more, or overused more.
It's definitely overused. And it's used in the wrong context, I think.
Yeah, that was a takeaway that I had from listening to you.
Cool. We got there. Well, that has been episode 204 of Arsenal Pass. Pankaj's off the cuff, off the blade cuff, off the fisticuffs episode. We didn't come to fisticuffs in the end, so it's all right. But we've got many more topics in the next few weeks. We're fast approaching Pro Tour London. We're in the final weeks of preparation for teams out there, for players out there who will be heading to London. We've got Calling Kobe this weekend. The format is starting to develop. We're starting to see what might be top dog as we come towards Pro Tour London. We're going to be discussing all things, I think, Classic Constructed as we get closer to that. We'll come with, sort of a preview episode to Pro Tour London as well. I want to say a massive shout out to all the Arsenal Pass patrons. Thank you to those that have been checking out our videos recently. We've had our Pankaj's new replay analysis up on the YouTube channel. We've also had our gameplay series. Next game is coming soon. I think it'll probably drop this weekend. I need to go and check the schedule. But Verdance, Aurora. Be interesting.
Woo!
Yeah. And we've got one more after that, which is, I think, Jarl and Fang as well, still to come. So a few nice matches in that gameplay series to come. And we'll do this again in the future for sure. But more additional content over on the Arsenal Pass Patreon. But Pankaj, I'll give you the final word if there's anything to say.
I think I have said my piece. The perspectives have been not announced, have been proclaimed or something. Have been said. Yeah, the thoughts have been expressed.
Been sent out,
and now my head is empty with no thoughts in it.
Well, that sounds like a good way to enjoy your evening, with empty thoughts and an empty mind. Thank you for listening to episode 204 of Arsenal Pass. Until next week, we'll see you in the next episode.